I'm going to walk through some information on the training and resource update plan for the updated Collegiate Officer Restructure. All right. What we'll cover tonight, I guess before we go over that list, if you do not know who I am Delaney Parker. I am the Director of Programming and Training for Sigma Kappa. I've been working on this project with the rest of the programming and training team, as well as really all of staff, to get this program or this project on track so that y'all have resources and training and information and everything that you need to be successful in the updated Collegiate Officer structure when it passes that convention. So we'll go over the plan overview. So what is forthcoming, some timelines, additional training details. So I'll show you some sneak peeks of what our updated resources will look like, some further details, all that fun stuff. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So what's included in the officer resource and training plan? Basically, everything that you're used to is going to be there still, plus a few exciting changes and updates. So we have updated all of our resources. We are currently in the midst of doing all of that, rebranding them, rephrasing them for officer changes, things that might be like a one-to-one changeover, updating the language so that it is easier to follow, a little bit more user-friendly, etc. In addition to that, some things that you might be used to: a transitions conversation guide, operational nuts and bolts, officer training workshop, summit for collegiate leadership, and continued education. So as we're looking through some of the other things, we'll have a revamped transitions conversations guide and workshop, and then some continued education is forthcoming beyond just like your 30, 60, 90 officer nuts and bolts that you're used to. So what is the expected timeline? So similar to what it has been in the past, in October, because we're going under the assumption that we will have an updated collegiate officer structure. In October, the same timeline that you're used to getting elections, resources, and information, etc., like when you should start elections, when your election should be done by, all that fun stuff. We will ensure that you have further information and instruction on how to run elections, say a new member or a potential officer. I guess they don't have to be a new member, but someone that might not know much different is like, I'm really interested in this position, and that position no longer exists. What do they do? How are they supposed to know what they might be interested in? We'll make sure that those resources are available to all of our chapters to say, oh, you like to be really creative and you're really good at social media. Maybe you should look into being the VP marketing or one of those officers, etc. Then in December through February, again, really similar timeline from what you're used to. We'll have nuts and bolts that'll go live in early December. Officers will then complete a transitions conversation. So adding a little bit more expectation and maybe specific questions for our officers to follow through to say, hey, what went well in this position? What do you think we could try this time as a novice or a green officer? Sometimes you don't know the questions to ask. So our incoming officers will have a template to really transition the information from the outgoing officer into the new one. And then we will also create a workshop for all of our officer teams to complete sometime in the winter time as they get going and start leading the chapter together, learning to lead as individuals in their respective officer roles, but also as a group of people leading the chapter. How can they collaborate? How can they delegate? How can they move forward together? And then February and beyond, again, we'll have the Summit for Collegiate Leadership. I have some further information about that in a later slide. And then again, continued education. So what does that education look like over the summer or in the fall? What do we need to be teaching officers now or later that, you know, we could teach in January, but you're going to forget by the time August rolls around, all that fun stuff. Moving into some updated resources. So I think one of the biggest changes that you'll see in our updated resources this fall into, I guess, the winter is we're moving away from the individualized single purpose resources. So instead of having a resource that is going to lead you through how to manage a team, it will be incorporated into a manual that will be accessible for that officer position. So they have everything that they need in one place. I know that there are a lot of resources that exist. And so something that we have done as we've been building out these manuals is to make sure that they are not in any way, shape, or form overwhelming. Our finance manual, that's a whole other story, but most of these manuals are 30 pages or less, and they're really instructions for how an officer will be able to complete their day-to-day work with some instruction, but also leaving space for chapters to do what's best for them outside of specific policies or maybe legal requirements, things like that. The manual will walk through a lot of those instructional things. Like I said, managing a team. How does this officer impact the SOE requirements? What are they required to do? How do they oversee it? We're looking at the chapter president's manual draft right now. So looking at how can we collaborate? What are some best practices for our chapter president? Stuff like that. Incorporated in these in every single manual will be things that you're used to seeing for any specific insert here chapter officer. So a job description, a timeline of what to do and when to do it, um, deadlines, timelines, etc., and then things that are specific to that role. So like for the chapter president, managing a team, roster management and changes, stuff like that. I'll just click through a little bit so you can kind of see. So we've compiled all this information. I know some of these pages look very similar to what those one-pagers used to look like. But incorporating a lot of the information so that it's in one place for our officers to find. Something that we've noticed in having the individual topic resources, while they are great and they can be applicable to multiple officers, sometimes with having one place to kind of go to and say, this is everything I need to know for my role, our officers are finding that some things are maybe slipping through the cracks, like, oh, I didn't know I had to do that. Maybe they missed seeing that resource, etc. So these will be built out for all of our officers. They will eventually be even more in depth and have all the information that, again, an officer needs to complete their role. We're also developing out an updated officer training workshop. So this will be more of a developmental opportunity for our officer teams to really get to know each other, how to work together better, and to start the year off right, if you will, with developmental training. So it will be a mix of prescribed and choose your own adventure sessions so that all of our officers could walk away knowing the same types of like developmental content. So we'll call it by the end of February next year. We know that all of our officers will have received training on building a collaborative team, having difficult conversations, setting goals, etc. But then based on your own chapter size, skills, preferences, what you feel like you need to work on, you can sift through some of these other topics to say, you know what, we are a mega chapter. We really need to work on delegation. That's never been a strong suit of ours. Great, we'll have that covered for you. Or we're such a small chapter that sometimes we get too in the weeds and we're having a really hard time kind of like moving past this one challenge so that we can impact the chapter more positively. Maybe let's work on having difficult conversations and setting some ground rules with each other to have a better, more maybe effective team unit and how we are processing challenges. So more information of that is forthcoming, but we know that a lot of our officers and chapters love the prescribed, but also love choosing their own things to focus on for what works best for them or their chapters. So kind of a mix of all of that. And then some things that are not changing, but this is a slight sneak peek. We will continue to have our Summit for Collegiate Leadership. Save the date, February 28 to March 2. It will be in Chicago. This year, we're only going to do one. So all of our officers will come together in one space and we'll be able to collaborate with each other instead of a regional based Summit for Collegiate Leadership. Our focus this year is going to be heavily on growth and retention and building a chapter that can focus and like really works and develops on those topics. And then, like I said, further information will be coming soon. And additional support, like I mentioned earlier, transitions conversations guide, operational nuts and bolts will still exist, and some continuing education opportunities throughout the calendar year. And that's where I got.
So first question, there's normally a specific end date for elections sometime in November by which they need to be held. Do we have that date yet for this upcoming cycle? And is it going to change based off this being a little new?
We will be flexible with chapters as we know that this election cycle and preparing members for the officer roles that they are going to want to submit letters of intent for, and probably having to rethink how they submit those letters of intent. We'll probably look at a later deadline for chapters than we do in the past. I think typically we try and have them wrapped by like November 15th. We'll probably be more flexible with going further than that.
Okay, awesome. In the current advisory structure, ERA supports the Vice President of Alumni Relations currently, and the membership experience supports Sisterhood Chair, with the chapter relations position merging those focuses. Is there a preference of which advisor chapter relations will go under?
So the focus of the work group right now and staff is really just getting to convention and seeing what happens there, if the proposal passes and if any changes are made. And then from that proposal, we will then start to talk about advisory board structure changes. So the plan right now is to, again, see how convention goes. And then assuming it passes in August, have relevant stakeholders, staff and volunteers come together to put together that draft, but really use the fall to make those changes and have those conversations, since it won't be fully implemented until January of 2025.
Okay, that makes sense. I remember hearing that chairs could be appointed and don't have to be elected. Is that the case?
Yes. So in the proposal in our bylaws, it still just states that vice presidents need to be elected by the chapter, but then directors and chairs can either be elected or appointed.
Okay, awesome. And then with the positions we choose, like our VP, obviously a mega chapter at UF. So with the positions we choose to choose as VPs or directors, etc., how long are we, quote, locked into that choice? Like, say we pick a VP and we realize that role did not need to be that elevated on the governing board. Can we switch it for the next election cycle? Are we locked in for a few years? Like, what's that like?
Like you mentioned, the next election cycle, of course, if it's something like extenuating and extreme, we can be flexible with chapters, but ideally the next election cycle, when you announce to the chapter, like these are the rules you can apply for, that's when you would make those changes.
Okay, specifically again about chapter relations. That seems to be the one that I think my collegiates are the most nervous about, of either that position being overworked or underworked, depending on if it's a VP or a director position, since it's combining both sisterhood activities and alumni activities. I've seen in some of the flowchart examples that some suggestions are to also have a sisterhood chair and an alumni chair. If that were the case, like what's left for chapter relations to do? Is it truly to just oversee those positions?
So one of our mega chapters that is actually piloting, you'll see in, oh my gosh, on the website under the structure mega recommendation C.
Okay.
It actually breaks out the chapter relations officer into having a director of sisterhood and a director of alumni events.
Yeah. So
So
when
there
that
would be a
happens,
chapter relations officer in that instance. It would just be those two separate roles, and we would have
okay.
courses for like a director of sisterhood and a director of alumni.
Okay. Okay. So if we chose to go that route, we wouldn't need to have the chapter relations position be a VP overseeing them.
Correct.
Okay. Awesome. All right. That was it. Thank you so much.
Question being, who makes a decision for which structure they go with, which vice presidents pulled from the bank of VPs are put on the governing board. On the website page and the additional resources, officer structure resources, you'll see there's like a draft resource called Understanding and Building Your Chapter's Officer Structure. So ultimately, it would be the responsibility of the ABS to have those conversations with their advisory board, their collegians, maybe up with their CDD if they feel it's necessary, to collaborate and decide which vice presidents they want to pull from that bank to serve on their advisory or their governing boards.
Hi, I just have a question as well. I was looking at the flow charts. We're a large chapter. I'm currently the president of Kappa Phi. And I know that we can have 8 VPs on all 3 of the recommended structures. Panhellenic relations and learning and development was elevated in lighter purple. So are those going to be designated to be on the governing board, or is that just an option? Because the other 2 are the darker purple.
Yeah, so those are just an option. So at the large structure, you must have a president, VP of finance, member integrity, recruitment, and event management. And then you can pick any 4 from the bank of vice presidents. But those were just how we outlined the recommendations for chapters that we're building up. But at the end of the day, it is the chapter's decision.
I see. That makes so much more sense. And then follow-up question as well. You had mentioned earlier, someone had mentioned earlier, about chairs and directors potentially being appointed. How is that decision decided for each chapter? Is it through the advisory board? Is it through the current chapter president? How does that work?
It's not a decision that necessarily needs like higher approval from an HQ or a district director. It's usually just the collaboration between the advisory board and the officers to discuss. Some chapters just have sort of their tradition in the way that they've always done it that they go with. From my collegiate management lens, we always recommend that chapters who are able to have elections for them always do, so that chapter members feel that they have a choice, but we know that's not always an option due to time constraints or number of positions during elections. But I would say collaborative conversation between officers and advisors is usually how those things are determined.
I see. Thank you so much. And then my last question would be, for example, for learning and development, it looks like it's combining the programming side of VPP and VPAE. For our chapter specifically, our VPAE typically has a heavier workload, and adding programming onto that could be a little bit much. So is that something that if we do decide to elevate that to vice president, could we make programming a director, or is there anything against that?
So there's actually an option to do a director of learning and development and a separate director of academic excellence. So I think that would probably be where we recommend, or like if you're elevating learning and development to a vice president, then having a director of academic excellence underneath that to do that separate workload.
I see. Awesome. Okay. That makes so much sense. Thank you so much.
I was under the impression that the recommendation options were just that, like recommendations, and like we don't have to like pick one and stick exactly to that, as long as, we do our number of VPs properly, have the required directors, etc. We could be flexible elsewhere. Is that the case, or do we have to pick like A, B, or C?
Nope, it's totally flexible. The recommendations are just for those chapters that we know love to see a recommendation and follow it. But outside of what is in those bylaws and what will be outlined in the NPH, so those required VPs and directors, it is a choose your own adventure for chapters.
Okay, love that. And then just to clarify, internal operations, originally I know it was not a VP, but to confirm, it has been elevated as a VP option now, correct?
Correct, it is in the bank.
Awesome, thank you.
Wonderful. I appreciate you all jumping on tonight and talking through some of the changes coming for our officer training and resource development with the new officer structure changes forthcoming. Like Christine has mentioned, a lot of this information is kind of pending the convention vote and will be sent out in further detail in whatever capacity that vote passes as. So we look forward to sharing more training and development information with you. But thanks so much for joining us. I hope you all had a great evening, and we look forward to hearing any questions that you might have in the future about officer training.